we got Jeremy Lee Quinn back on the channel. Jeremy, thanks for joining me here. We're talking domestic terrorism today, and in light of, there's been actually several separate movements to try to stop any new legislation to expand essentially federal powers to crack down on domestic terrorism or to define domestic terrorism. And I guess the thing I'd love to talk to you about, since you've been covering all kinds of groups, and as you said, you don't even say left, right, far right often anymore, because they seem to be, very muddled, at least far more complex than mainstream news allows for. But as you've been covering these groups, I figured you'd be able to give us some good insight into what you're thinking and who would perhaps be, targeted if these powers were expanded. You were bringing up that Atlantic article. Is it okay if we talk about that first to kind of set the stage about who was at the Capitol? Because this all obviously is coming after the Capitol riot. And so we have to kind of look at, that event itself, and you were there. But this article in the Atlantic has also shed some light on who was there. So do you mind kind of running me through this? And I'm going to show it to folks who are watching so they can kind of see it. It's called "The Capitol Rioters Aren't Like Other Extremists." That they analyzed 193 people arrested in connection with the January 6th riot and found a new kind of American radicalism.
Sure. And this is a very interesting piece. It comes out of a center out of the University of Chicago, which is called the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. And what's interesting about this piece in the Atlantic is they break down 193 arrestees, which amounts to about a fourth of the people that they believe were in the Capitol. And of those 193 that are arrested, only 1 out of 10 belong to any sort of group affiliation. That means they showed up repping Proud Boys or 3%ers or Oath Keepers, the 3%ers and Oath Keepers being the biggest militia movements. Now, what's interesting about that is that makes 9 out of 10 of those who are arrested in the Capitol not a part of any of these quote unquote extremist groups. Here's a very interesting statement that was given to me directly, and you're getting this straight from the project, the University of Chicago project, which again is called the Chicago Project on Security and Threats, which analyzed 193 arrestees. This was interesting. This is what I had been trying to get from the Southern Poverty Law Center. How many of these people were actual white nationalist gangs, white supremacists, ethno-nationalists that we have been so consumed with in mass media since January the 6th? Now listen to this answer. Jeremy, there was only one person among the 193 arrested for attacking the Capitol with any gang. And then he emphasizes the chart does not specify the type. The chart says 1% of those arrestees had a gang affiliation. This is what he's referring to. He goes on to say the gang in question is the Latin Kings, not a white nationalist gang. We found no evidence of specifically white nationalist gangs, parentheses, skinheads, hammerskins, Aryan Brotherhood, etc., among the arrested. What are we reacting to with this kind of legislation? Because as that Atlantic article details, there were more of these gang affiliations that came out of extremist right activity before 2020.
Right, and I'm showing folks the pie charts that the Atlantic has here, where the one on the left, it's right-wing extremist arrests 2015 to 2020, and so the unaffiliated citizens are about half of the pie. Whereas when you look at the Capitol Hill insurrection arrests, is what they're calling it, 2021, 89% are unaffiliated citizens. And Jeremy, just to give people a little bit more qualification on how they were making these determinations, to read here, we erred on the side of inclusion. We counted an arrestee as affiliated with such an organization if any court documents or news articles describe the person as a member, refer to social media posts expressing an affinity for a certain group, or attest to patches or apparel that directly indicate support. So they were basically anything that may have tied you, they would have included you in that. And they still came back with, 89%, so almost 90% not affiliated.
The Atlantic article also references in this report that most of the people are over 40 years of age. We also learned that 40% of them are of white collar or business owners. So this is a different group, essentially, that and I'd almost define it as a populist extremism. So it's interesting because, again, we're focused when we talk about terror legislation on this idea that you have these militias and gangs and ethno-nationalist groups that have essentially been behind all this, and it's just not what I saw. And many of us who were on the ground that day were quick to try to point that out, but a lot of people in the media weren't interested in hearing from us on the ground, and that's a whole other issue.
Well, and it brings up a couple interesting points too, Jeremy, because to kind of back up a smidge, when the whole conversation around Trump wanting and his administration talking about labeling Antifa as a domestic terrorist group, and then DHS was coming out saying that actually white supremacists are the number one threat to homeland security. That was a conversation that's been happening over the last couple of years. So the question that a lot of people are asking is, okay, well, say that, DHS is, I'm actually looking at an article right now. This was from US News from October 6, 2020, DHS white supremacist, the most persistent and lethal threat within the US, talking about that issue. And even the folks who are saying, hey, yeah, we have to get on top of this concern. Here's another letter that was just released by Human Rights Coalition, or by Human Rights Watch. Coalition urges Congress not to expand domestic terrorism charges. In their detail here, they're talking about, hey, yeah, actually, we really think you guys should be going after white supremacists, but you already have enough rules in place to do it. You don't need to expand it. And if you do expand it, you're just going to keep coming after us, basically, the people that we're concerned about in, this article here. They basically write, we are concerned that a new federal domestic terrorism statute or list would adversely impact civil rights. And as our nation's long and disturbing history of targeting Black activists, Muslims, Arabs, and movements for social and racial justice has shown, this new authority could be used to expand racial profiling or be wielded to surveil and investigate communities of color and political opponents in the name of national security. So you are seeing people, that are concerned about that particular issue of white supremacy, also saying we don't want you to create new laws. So it's an interesting conversation here too. Like, who would, if you did have these new rules, would they actually be used to target who they're saying they want to target? Would they be used to target somebody else? And the pushback has not been necessarily like from the Proud Boys per se. You're seeing a lot of people, even like on the progressive left, for instance, Rashida Tlaib, this is from her Twitter account. I'm leading the call for national security powers to not be expanded in light of the attack on our nation's capital that occurred 2 weeks ago, as such measures often lead to the erosion of Americans' civil liberties.
It's very interesting if you listen to what anarchists and anti-fascists, those who have been Antifa aligned, they're the ones who could see their MO affected the most. So it's interesting to see even left-wing, quote unquote, extremists be extremely concerned about this, but we all should be. And first and foremost, because it's not following any empirical evidence. As I described to you, and as that Atlantic article points out, if you have 9 out of 10 of the arrestees without any affiliation, so are we imagining? Is it our fears that are trying to set these new legislative actions into motion? Because they certainly don't seem to be based on actual evidence. We're dealing with different sectors of extremism, and they each, I think, need to be parsed, need to be dealt with, and not sensationalized. Because what we're hearing, and what the Atlantic article is so good at pointing out, is that we're dealing with something, and the article even says we're going to have to look at this in a more detailed way to really understand what it is.
Yeah, and
to just
and you don't
lump it all together, in other words, I think is a mistake.
Yeah, you don't, and you still don't hear that term populism as often, I think, as it could apply to these different groups, and just the wave of new political ideology. As you were mentioning, the article says in really the first graph here that it's a new kind of violent mass movement in which more, quote, normal Trump supporters, middle class, and in many cases, middle-aged people without obvious ties to the far right, joined with extremists in an attempt to overturn a presidential election. And if you scroll down to past that pie chart where they're talking about the affiliations, it says capital arrestees are older than earlier right-wing extremists. So where they were talking about the 2015 to 2020 arrests, where they were 61% less than 35 years old, the Capitol Hill insurrection arrests, they say, are 68% age greater than 35. So you even have an older crowd here that's participating in this. And then again, they talk about most Capitol arrestees hail from pro-Biden and battleground counties. So that they're not necessarily coming from just like, deeply entrenched red areas. It's not that these authors aren't talking about that there isn't danger, or in fact, they say that a couple times, like this could be very dangerous. We could be going to a dangerous movement. We need to understand this. But they are also very clear that the old way of looking at these classifications does not work in this case.
It doesn't. The old classifications need to be reevaluated. And I think that can be what you just said, that can be applied to the entire year of 2020 in the sense that I think we need to start reevaluating and not using, trying to figure out a new lens for this. Because if our popular culture, our media, our social media, the collective polarization, if all of that gives cover and fuels constant demonization and deplatforming, that's the most disturbing part of this. If we want to start talking about domestic terror laws, are people in the meantime just slightly disturbed by how quickly mass groups of conservatives were deplatformed? And I don't think this makes, I've said this before, I don't think this makes us safer in the least when people are sent to encrypted corners in chat rooms far away from view. I was able to look on Parler. I didn't have any real connections on it, but I was able to follow certain accounts and be aware of the temperature, so to speak, of the right, because it's not just the far right. And as I said, I stopped using the terms far right and far left. I don't think they make sense anymore, because what that does is that puts everything at a distance very conveniently. And I think everything is a lot more closer and tied into the populace and our sort of tabloid persecution and penchant for demonization that we're all hooking into. It's coming from activist Twitter to tabloids to TV, and we're so far off from what's actually going on the streets that it's getting, you're reaching this fever pitch where it has actual results in potential results in forms of anti-terror legislation and labeling certain groups terrorists. And I've seen people comment that they want the whole Republican Party labeled terrorists. That's the pitch of the rhetoric that you get on social media and Twitter.
And there aren't, even in the mainstream world, the mainstream journalism world, because there aren't so many journalists who are actually spending considerable amount of time trying to understand what's going on face to face with these groups, and rather, even if you're a local news station, you're just recycling in a lot of ways the talking points from the affiliate, and maybe they're recycling the talking points from a wire service. So there's maybe two reporters that are doing a lot of the legwork for, and they're not full time on this, which is why you get better understandings from, say, like Vice, if you're going to look at it, an organization or an independent person like yourself who actually has the time to really spend to understand the nuances. Like we talked about the last time you were on my channel, it's like a foreign language. You have to spend a lot of time to understand the nuances of a foreign language, and even the accents and all that stuff. That when you go live somewhere else, there are even mannerisms that you make with your face that are interpreted a certain way in a different country versus your own. And it is something that you don't just know by doing one 45-minute interview with somebody and moving on to the next topic, which is what a lot of, especially in television news, that's what a lot of people are doing. I'm Jeremy, I'm showing people this article from the New York Times from January 26th. Capitol Police Chief apologizes for security failures during assault, where, she basically talks about how they knew that this was potentially going to happen, right? That there was definitely intelligence information. Here's the quote: that she knew there was a strong potential for violence, but they failed to take adequate steps to prevent what she described as a terrorist attack, and then continues to detail, what they think happened, and they should have been more prepared, and that we knew some of these participants were intending to bring firearms. We knew there was a strong potential for violence. The department prepared in order to meet these challenges, but we did not do enough. And that there was no match for the tens of thousands of people that were there. And so your mind does kind of go to, listen, if you've already got an FBI, which was expanded, I read, under the Trump administration, you already have the Patriot Act after 9/11. You have a police department that's like, actually, we knew this could happen, but we just didn't prepare. It just, I think it's fair for people to question, why now? What is going on right now that is necessitating this call within the intelligence community for more crackdowns?
It goes back to misunderstanding what happened. And what I saw as somebody who's been on the ground since May, the term is called autonomous organizing. And this was a term that the anarchists were using about the Minneapolis 3rd Precinct when it was sacked, that this was a show of autonomous organizing. In other words, this wasn't something that was planned with precision, but came almost improvisationally out of the zeitgeist of the moment. And that's where the similarities are that we're missing, because people are so emotionally tied to, well, don't even talk about the 3rd Precinct and the Capitol in the same sentence, because, look, I get it. Take out what people believe. People will do anything for what they believe. Let's take that out of the equation. Let's look at what the structure and the tactics that were used.
Let me ask you this, though. When people push back and say, yeah, but it was the timing of this that made it so nefarious and made it what it was, that it was on the day of an election certification, and so it's not, as you're saying, the act itself, if we were to take away the ideology, that they are inextricably linked because of the timing in the day, that these people were trying to overturn an election, and this should be treated differently. What do you think about that?
When it comes down to the certification of the election, I think that's everything that we're going to see in the impeachment trial, because it is somewhat nefarious in the sense that Mike Pence never had the authority to do what the president of the United States was telling his followers that the vice president had the authority to do. His role was procedural. We know that. Everybody was hyped up on a fiction. And we're seeing more, if you listen to center right or even right wing commentators, what we're starting to hear are people are coming forward who got carried away from the whole thing, and that there is some introspection. I even talked to a conservative activist who's a little bit of a provocateur, someone who I've seen city to city. And that activist said to me, they didn't know what they would have done. They said, thank God I wasn't up near the Capitol, because knowing me, I would have gotten swept up into it.
Here's another article from Business Insider. I know this was trending a little bit ago, that the lawyer for the Q shaman, that guy that was wearing the headdress and everything, who's storing the Capitol in fur headdress with horns, says his client feels duped after Trump didn't pardon him. And that his lawyer blamed Trump for motivating the mob to march on the Capitol building. And so, hey, maybe if he had been pardoned, he would still have been, sticking with his original talking points. But it is interesting that you brought that up, and then this guy that is all over the internet with his pictures, I can't remember if he was in the Senate or the House chambers, but yeah, here it is. He regrets very, very much having not just been duped by the president, but by being in a position where he allowed that duping to put him in a position to make decisions he should not have made. Now, and then here, this is my fear. As to my client, the guy with the horns and the fur, the meditation and organic food, I'm telling you that we cannot simply wave a magic wand and label all these people on January 6th the same, he added. It is interesting, like that guy, I guess he has refused to eat because they weren't giving him organic food, so because he gets sick if he doesn't eat organic or something. And it just brings up again, just the hodgepodge of ideas. I will say though, I at the end of the day, I think people are responsible for their behavior. I both understand that mob mentality because I have covered these events in the past where you could see how just the emotional contagion takes people places that they otherwise perhaps wouldn't have or never would have, not even perhaps, but just by themselves, which I always say, if you're going to go to an event like this, it's not like going to the grocery store and running into your adversary and have them yell something at you in the ketchup aisle. It's very different when there are hundreds or thousands, tens of thousands of people screaming and there's loud noises and there's tear gas or whatever else, and so you have to be careful. At the same time though, at the end of the day, Trump or no Trump, I still feel like people are responsible for their behavior. And so even though you are seeing some of this like recanting, it does kind of make me say, well, it's convenient, I guess. You didn't get pardoned and now you just regret it.
Well, you recant when you get caught and when you get carried away, so to speak. And I think that when we look at, I was reviewing video just last night, and what's extraordinary is that at 12:53, but while the president was still speaking, was when the first groups arrived at about a dozen Capitol police officers in front of the Capitol at a couple of barricades. They made short work. Within 30 seconds of that arrival, they were already pushing the barricades. Within a minute and a half, they had completely overrun those first barricades and were pushing the Capitol Police back from the edge of the Capitol lawn and making their way up. Now, again, the geography of what I saw when I arrived a little later in the 2 p.m. hour, was when I got to the edge of the Capitol lawn, there were already 2 to 3 football fields of people crammed up to get all the way to the terrace. And that's going up the side as well, where you saw the white covering ripped off of the scaffolding, and people were even climbing up and down the interior of the scaffolding, scaling walls. It was unlike, I think, anybody expected. So again, this comes down to autonomous organizing and what that is. In leftist terms, anarchists and Antifa-aligned groups have always characterized autonomous organizing as not being explicitly planned. What I think we saw was an appropriation, essentially, of the leftist playbook. And that goes beyond just the idea and the concept of autonomous organizing. And, both these sides have been very out in the open about this conflict. When I say this conflict, I mean civil unrest and back and forth between the right and the left, the militant right and left, or the activated right and the left, whatever you want to call it. It goes back to election night. In the San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm from, there was rioting in San Francisco the night Trump was elected. There was rioting in Oakland across the bay later that week for several days. When I say rioting, I mean destruction of property. When you had actual attacks on conservatives, that played out in January and February at UC Berkeley, where Antifa groups would show up and they would shut down these right-wing speakers. There were physical attacks on conservatives. This took place also on Inauguration Eve, January the 19th, 2017, in Washington, D.C., at the event called the Deplorable. People had bottles thrown at them. So what we're talking about is a back and forth that dates back to the very beginning of the Trump presidency, when it comes to, if you want to just look at organizing, resistance organizing is what it was characterized on the left, while the right responded to it, and in a lot of cases has appropriated the resistance culture. And on New Year's Eve, when on my YouTube channel, Unblocked podcast, I was hosting a talk between a Proud Boys organizer and a Black Lives Matter organizer from Utah who became friends. There was heavy concern about how much blowback there would be when the disenfranchisement from power felt on the right would then boomerang all of these tactics. All of this animus would sort of come back and come rushing back and pushed in the other direction. I did not know it would be so soon, that it would be so violent in the end, and that it would take place on January the 6th. I did not anticipate what was going to happen and what did happen in any way, especially on that scale. And that's when it becomes this organic, autonomous thing. So when we talk about terror legislation and what are we really going after, is it being applied to our understanding of the crowd, of who was there? The first people I interviewed at that January the 6th were two women called praying grandmas. Praying grandmas were celebrating and hugging each other that they had been in the Capitol. And that's on my website, publicreport.org, by the way. And I do have a page, publicreport.org/capital with an O, capital, all lowercase, in which I do lay out some of these interviews from that day. What's astounding, again, we're missing the point. If we're imagining terror gangs and militias being the driving force behind January the 6th, again, we're missing that 9 out of 10 of those 193 arrestees were unaffiliated. So, and very pedestrian. We're seeing more interviews on the right where people who were in the Capitol are coming forward. They're being honest about how they were swept up in it, what they thought Mike Pence had the power to do, which was clearly not the case for any of us who had really, but they were so confined to echo chambers. This goes back again to polarization and the danger of being able to pluck information that just tells you exactly what you want to hear. These communities and these bonds were being formed online, I would say quite organically, around a misinformative narrative.
Well, and I think it doesn't help when the story is not told well in sort of the mainstream outlets, to go back to my background in journalism. If you feel like the nuances are not covered, or there's some kind of agenda there that's targeting you, or you know, they just don't get me. They don't get me. People think like, well, you know, the silencing it or cutting off communication or just the access that some of these people have helps. But I think it drives them even further to seek more extremist ideas and people who think just like them, because they're like, nobody gets me. So I'm just going to find more people who think like me because they don't get me at all. My voice isn't being heard. And I think it makes it worse. And Jeremy, looking at this National Terrorism Advisory Bulletin from January 27th. This is from the Department of Homeland Security. You know, they're talking about domestic violent extremists, DVEs, and so this is the range of
domestic violent
extremists. Yep,
in the bulletin.
And they're talking about these are the range of issues that unite this group of extremists, right? That they're going to start targeting more. Anger over COVID-19 restrictions. 2020 election results, and police use of force. These are, so these three things plus more, but those were the three main things that they're like.
That's pretty broad.
Yeah, exactly.
When you're talking about, dissatisfaction with the election, COVID-19 restrictions. I mean, this is stuff that obviously I heard in the crowd that people were upset about, including railing against corporate media and big tech. But to say that, again, you're misidentifying what's really going on, in the sense that if you don't recognize just how broad and tied to populism those concerns are. And
right. And that's, but see, that's exactly, that's such a great point, because their answer, is and by there I mean, some of the federal government spokespeople that we've been seeing calling for more, more surveillance or more crackdown. That's their answer versus, actually addressing potentially the problems that these people are concerned about. For instance, if you're going to talk about COVID-19 restrictions and people not being able to have healthcare or keep their businesses open, and Congress is stuck refusing to give checks to people and while they're expanding their their salaries or whatever else, it's like, well, let's just label them domestic violent extremists and then expand terrorism laws, instead of saying, well, maybe people are struggling right now and they're really angry about the fact that either they on the one end with the COVID-19 restrictions, that they feel like the government doesn't care that the economy is going under and their businesses are really struggling, if not completely non-existent, while they're watching their government leaders defy their own mandates in some cases, or, the police use of force, people that are very concerned over, the justice system and whether it's working for everybody and all that stuff. Like, having the conversations and addressing the real issues versus going to, the labeling of terrorism. I find that a fascinating dynamic.
This is what I'm concerned about. That this vacuum, there's so much distrust with media right now that there is this information vacuum. And so I think to really address that in terms of what you're talking about, which is this widespread dissatisfaction, if you don't deal honestly with extreme behavior on both sides, if you only focus on one side, well, then that leaves the other side to essentially fill the vacuum with whatever conspiracy that is ripe on social media, on Twitter, from activists. And when I say activists, that can be from the left or the right. And if you think of all of the attacks against the right that have taken place since the beginning of 2017, the beginning of the Trump presidency, there was a movement which was punch a Nazi in the face. There was no distinction made between actual Nazis, actual white supremacists, and conservatives with red hats. So if you have this punch a Nazi in the face, which became punch MAGA in the face, that's what the banner read on November the 14th when the Black Bloc marched into Washington, D.C. and beat on Trump supporters as they were coming back from Freedom Plaza after the first Million MAGA march on November the 14th. When you think about that incessant cultural phenomenon, which is, okay, we get to punch these people. We get to punch them in the face. Well, if that's not covered, if that's tacitly even approved by some, leftist activist types who see themselves on the right, quote unquote, right side of history, well, then you have this huge vacuum of, well, who are these people dressed head to toe in black who are showing up with hammer and sickles? You don't understand that, or perhaps are willing to give it the time to research, oh, okay, that comes from a leftist autonomous organization, and there are these disparate groups that are not centralized, but they're organized horizontally. You're asking people who are being attacked to give an incredible amount of nuance when it's much easier to just say, there's a communist takeover going on right now. I see it everywhere. I'm being shut down. People are being punched in the face, and now people are having their businesses burned down. So from that point of view, if we don't deal with extreme, not just rhetoric, but behavior on collectively, holistically, I would even say, then we're not dealing with it at all. We have to deal with it as a whole. Because otherwise, if you persecute one sector of society and tell them that they're terrorists now, and you start passing legislation presumably to curb their speech or the risk that they will be inflamed once again, well, careful what you wish for. I think that's what a lot of the anarchists and anti-fascists on the far left are saying, that this is not being looked at. The hysteria is fueling it. And to what end will those measures be used?
It doesn't always end well when people have lost the kind of trust that they've lost that we're seeing right now in our basic institutions.
That's where we need to really get beyond this point scoring, this back and forth where, okay, I'm scoring this point against your side and your side and your side, because though we think that benefits us, it really doesn't. When I say us, I mean if you're on one side or the other of the political spectrum. If you think having a media establishment totally behind you in lockstep, it really isn't going to benefit in the long run, because you might be able to push through a sort of demonization of one side, but it's not going to. It's interesting to see it shift too from person to person. Well, Trump's out of the way. We don't want to obsess about him, so let's talk about this other politician, or let's put our focus over here.
Well, and even with him gone, now the target is Trumpism. So he can be gone, but now Trumpism is the problem. Like when we saw that Reddit thread that was going after GameStop, and that was a lot of like CNBC, CNN, they had articles blaming MAGA for that, even though the investors themselves were talking about the crash of 2008 and the bank bailouts. So once again, kind of missing the point. But even with Trump gone, you can still keep the Trumpism train going.
I think what it comes down to is us being either in the media, on the left, however you want to culturally frame it. The people who feel that they're not disenfranchised at this moment, who did feel they were for the last 4 years. The question is, well, are you going to listen? Are you going to try to figure out what that Trumpism is? What is it that it's a response to?
And looking at your own side and saying, how did we participate in creating some of this phenomenon? Because I think that's the other issue, is that, and I have seen different reactions from different news outlets. Some I have a video I'm about to upload to my channel where, like, Crystal Ball, for instance, on Rising on the Hill, where she talks about, hey, she's talking about the post-election stuff and the riot at the Capitol, and she actually says, I regret the deplorables thing, where I said sometimes the truth hurts, and I regret my part in the tribalism and the language that inflamed things, and I understand why people are skeptical of this. That's one reaction that people in the media can have, which I think is helpful. Or you can do the thing that a lot of the journalists have done, which is just consistently wagging the finger at the public, like, you don't like us, well, you just don't like the truth. If you don't like us, you just don't like the truth. You're just a troll. You live somewhere that is not in our sphere of reality, and so we're not going to even try to understand why you don't trust us. We're not going to try to understand your frustration or anger. Again, saying, as I said before, that people are responsible for their behavior. But if those of us in those positions you're talking about aren't looking at our own groups and doing some self-reflection on our own about our part in all this, and even local news stations I've seen that they decided to look at the viewer and say, our place is here, so if you don't like it, well, suck it up. I mean, they don't say it exactly like that, but that attitude, I feel like, is, come on, how bad does it have to get before we start saying that's not the answer? Looking at people who distrust us and just saying we're clean. Our hands are clean. We haven't had any part in this. Come on, like, are you asleep? Are you just being totally disingenuous? Like, what is going on here that at least those of us in media, like, still don't see our role in this? That to me is incredulous.
The judgment has already, in some people's mind, been entered, that this is not allowed to be heard because it's uneducated, or it's whatever the verdict is. It's a faulty way to proceed forward, because ultimately what they're responding to, what they when I say they, I mean the other side that feels disenfranchised, and people say, well, this is, if you look at the breakdown from the Atlantic, for example, that these are people with jobs, or these are not disenfranchised. People can be disenfranchised in other ways. We don't have to be talking about just what somebody's income is. It can be cultural disenfranchisement, or a perception of power, who's in power, who represents them, representational disenfranchisement. But culturally, there's a social authoritarianism that has played out, and that I would say is the key to the through line to the type of extremism that I've seen play out, not just on the streets, but also online, as far as what people are allowed to say, how they're allowed to express themselves, whether they are allowed to be heard even. The idea of deplatforming is so insidious to me of anybody. And if I have an extremist view, it's that people should be heard, and they shouldn't be deplatformed. And that goes all the way to the president of the United States, or former president of the United States, I should say, who I'm no fan of. I do not think deplatforming is the answer. I just don't. I think it is socially corrosive. I think that what we are doing is sending people even further away to consolidate power. All this persecution we see in the headlines of, what's her name, Marjorie Taylor Greene, I don't know that it does what people think. When people think they're being stalwart, champions of truth, a lot of it is in the way that you engage with someone. And if the way that you engage is, well, cancel this person, deplatform them, cast them out, that line of attack has not been working. And I don't understand what has to be said for people to understand that persecution and deplatforming only causes those who are targeted to dig their heels in and consolidate around more extreme positions.
Again, going back to our original talking point here, the domestic terrorism stuff, to just think that you got rid of Trump and you have a government all of a sudden that is just for the people, and we could just all relax. There's no reason to pay attention to what the government is doing behind the scenes. I think is naive, and if it's something I plan to pay attention to, I'm sure you do too. Just to kind of keep an eye on it, and not just the government itself, but the way people are responding to it. As you're talking about, the way that people respond to it, and continuing to feel like their voices are just not being included in the conversations.
I think the answer from folks who I see, and they're not in my immediate circle, because if I'm on social media, I really can't broach a lot of this conversation. But on Twitter, for example, for folks who want to connect and seem to indicate that they are the same frame of mind, the idea is that if you have speech that is flawed, that you engage with it and you present better speech from your perspective. And when it goes back to those COVID briefings that you mentioned back in the spring, as a reporter, if you're there, I know it's tempting to want to make the president look bad or catch him being stupid or whatever, but you had all these other people that were there that you could have engaged and asked more extensive questions to sort of get to the bottom. So if he says one thing and then you engage somebody else, then there's a way to offset faulty speech with better speech or more. So the trick, I think, is to not, and I use this as a rule on Twitter too, to not fall into some sort of even though you might get more eyes on you, you have to resist. We have to all resist temptation in some ways, because it might be more exciting if I went after that person, or if I tried to, and you might create buzz, but then it's just entertainment. And that's what the problem is that that news and trying to figure out how to move forward, how to agree, is eclipsed by the entertainment of division and polarization. And so we did get sucked into a reality show for the last, couple of years. And a lot of people, from what I can tell, want to keep on it. They want to keep pointing the finger, or persecuting, or finding the next bad guy to fill in, and it becomes this insatiable addiction in which you're trying to put the culture war front and center in people's timeline, always, that this is what we're going to have to deal with. And it shouldn't be that. It should be a lot more boring. That's why I've been doing 2-hour conversations, and people should be able to drift in and out and say, okay, well, I don't agree on that, or I want to hear more about that point. It should be a little bit less entertaining than it's been. And I feel that we're all addicted in some sense to doom scrolling this fight, as if it were a real, an episode of reality television. And we need to get away from that.
Yeah.
We need to engage, and it should be complicated. It should be less exciting.
Well,
it should get less.
Or
likes.
Look at it the other way, which is it's exciting to find contrarians, or perspectives that are different than what everybody else thinks or assumes. That was my favorite part about being a reporter, was talking to people that defied expectations and narratives and boxes and homogeneity that was assumed by people who were trying to define individuals that are hard to define. And I like that. And I wish we were at a place where that was more interesting, where ideas that challenged ours were more interesting instead of emotionally triggering. So hopefully, Jeremy, you and I put people to sleep, or we excited them. We put them to sleep just with the ennui of our talking, or maybe they found it interesting to hear different perspectives. I hope they did.
I don't think we're the problem. I think I think it's our elected officials that need to stop getting into feuds, and it might get the likes and the views and the influence, but it's not, at the end of the day, productive.
It does seem like a lot like the way that the conversations are framed, whether it's government officials or the journalists covering them, the questions asked and the answers given are it's almost like people can't even stop regurgitating a framed tweet. Like, that's just how brains work now. And so, when you're thinking about how am I going to respond to my political adversary, or if I'm a journalist, how am I going to hold the government accountable? It's not like, in other words, I'm not seeing as often, questions that are posed for actual education of the public. It's more like, how will this sound on Twitter or Facebook or in that quick soundbite in tonight's newscast, right. And it's framed for that now, because in a lot of ways, especially, again, to go back to television, there's a little bit of theater to it now. Maybe there always was, but with the increase in use of social media, there's even more. And one of the reasons I hate Twitter is because of how short you have to keep everything that you write. And I'm not going to sit there and write an entire 60 tweets or whatever. And so I find myself not wanting to go on Twitter, mostly because I can't, it's hard for my brain to encapsulate what I'm trying to say in 2 sentences. And so unless I'm going to make a joke or post a picture of my dog or horse or something, I'm just like, I'm not going on Twitter today.
Well, yeah, especially because you see what plays, what gets picked up and what is trending is this divisive tabloid material. And the danger of all of this, again, is that news organizations are looking that way. So they look at what's trending on Twitter, which gets picked up by tabloids. Next thing you know, it's on TV. And that's the problem, is that we're not going to the ground. Local news, I think, is doing the job that local news has always done, which is you do talk to the people on the ground who are there and experiencing something.
Yeah.
But national news, cable news, certainly has been MIA in any respect when it comes to the political unrest and the social conflict. They've been MIA in the sense that they haven't been really parsing what's been going on. It's been used for partisan
even local news is really struggling, not simply because like folks like myself, we had to shoot, edit, write, do all of our own stuff. We had 2 hours to get it all done. We had we had to keep it to 90 seconds or less. There's all these resource and time constraints and whatnot. But I also think that the more that we've had this environment of acceptable thought and acceptable questions and acceptable narratives, that is pervasive among even the local journalists who are just maybe scared to ask questions or to share voices that are, potentially going to get the mob to come after them on Twitter. So the same homogeneity, groupthink, echo chamber, and fear that plagues national news, reporters, is trickled into local news. And so, yeah, even if you are closer and probably with your local issues, you're better at covering them. But even with local issues themselves, there's still a lot of ideological purity standards, of what's an acceptable voice to allow. And I've had managers who said, I will never let that voice on my, because they genuinely believe that is a dangerous voice to share. But that to me, I mean, as just kind of I consider myself a pretty rational person who tries to see all different sides of things. Like in those conversations, there was never in my mind that what they were discussing was so dangerous we had to not share it in the larger scope of the story we were covering. I just found that to be that person's particular bias towards them. So even in local news, you have those problems. And again, too, we've talked about this, like they're shorter staffed and newspapers are dying, at a high rate. They're cutting staff. Yeah. And so it's even if you're a well-intentioned journalist, it's very difficult in today's world to do a good job. And then even if you're not trying to dupe people, you're suffering from your own confirmation bias. And if you're scared to put your neck out there because you're like, well, I don't want the Twitter mob to come after me, or I don't want to lose my job or whatever else. And that's why we need to continue having the conversations as independents so that hopefully it gets easier for people, and I'm not trying to to be like, oh, they're the victims of their own, whatever. It's just, I think the more people have these conversations and normalize talking points that are not just fixated in that mainstream narrative, then it becomes like the ice starts to melt, and people feel more comfortable talking about this stuff in a way that isn't as rhetorically divisive. Anyway, I got to run, Jeremy. It was really great talking with you.
Great talking
as
with
always.
You too.
Is there anything that you want to add for my channel anyway before I go that we didn't talk about?
No, just I agree that we should keep having these conversations. I'm going to keep trying. On my Twitter is Lee Quinn, and publicreport.org is where I've published my discoveries from the last 8 months of traveling to over 15 cities. And I hope that I can get a little bit more of the information out there. So I appreciate you having me.